Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some pathofexile 1 discussion. Today, I'm finally going to get around to tackling the thorny question of loot in patch 3.29, because I think it's a lot more complex than people are saying online. I knew this was going to require a lot of thought because my experience through the campaign, through clearing the Atlas, and through early days was that I was getting more loot than I was in Mirage. And then I'm talking to people, and one group of players are saying, yeah, that's the same. That's the same. I've been getting more loot than Mirage or comparable loot to Mirage. Definitely not feeling like it's been nerfed a lot. And then another group are saying exactly the opposite and vehemently saying the opposite. And so I'm trying to look and see exactly what's going on. And I think I might have digged my way to the bottom of the matter. There is, however, one thing that has to be said before we can get into the meat of this video and get into both me presenting my own opinions, but also opinions of other people that I've seen and that I genuinely think are worth your consideration as well, because you might share them. And that is that I have a material incentive as a content creator to catastrophize the situation. I will make more money if you are angry at the game and watching my videos, binge watching them, than I would if you end up being really happy with the game and you go back to playing the game and you click off this video quickly. This is something that I think is very important for you to keep in mind when you're assessing any sort of content that you see that's really negative about the current state of the game. I learnt this back in patch 0.2.0 of pathofexile 2. This was a patch that was poorly received. I was less negative on it than most. And so I put out a video that was not really defending the patch, but saying there's lots of problems with it, but I think that this is a 4 out of 10 patch rather than a 2 out of 10 patch. Anyways, that video kind of flopped, didn't make all that much money. A day or two later, there was a new update and I put out some more coverage on that. However, this day I was in a foul mood. I don't know why I was in a foul mood, but I was. Probably been spending too much time on Reddit. And so I then made a much angrier video. Not because I really felt more negative, but because I was just in a bad mood. And then when I made my thumbnail for it, I put a big burning bin on it, a dumpster fire. That video did far better. That video was more of an appropriate response to a 2 out of 10 expansion, rather than one I still thought was a 4 out of 10, not a 2 out of 10. And so that ended up making about twice the money that the previous video had made. And that was when I learned just how substantial this financial incentive is to catastrophize things. I don't use this, I don't misuse this information, but I think it's very important that you're aware of it and that you're always thinking critically about it, especially when you're looking to the opinion of anyone that is a professional content creator. We don't get paid by grinding your games to be shills for the game. Actually, we kind of end up in this spot where the most money that we can make is by being anti-shills. You want to keep that in mind. I'm not saying that people who are very prominent in the pathofexile community and that are more negative than I am towards this patch are actually doing this, but you just want to have this in your critical thinking mindset whenever you're assessing anything related to the current state of the game. Okay, aside over. There's a lot of people who are saying that between 3.28 and 3.29, there were sweeping nerfs to loot. And actually, the biggest nerf that we're finding now is one that took place earlier. This is the nerf that took place from 3.27 to 3.28. It was a very tightly targeted nerf where grinding gear games essentially deleted all of the tier 17 exclusive map farming strategies, except the ones that were about tier 17 exclusive loot. So firstly, let's start with the tier 17 exclusive loot, and this stuff hasn't changed. So this is the unique helmet like Wraithlord, this is the unique item Yoke of Suffering. These sorts of things that drop from the bosses of tier 17 maps, they seem roughly unchanged. The other thing that was roughly unchanged was the Uber Pinnacle boss fragments. Yes, there were some changes to those, but there haven't been substantial changes to the way that they spawn. However, the big losses for tier 17 strategies, and the reason that no one really tries to juice the maps anymore, is that tier 17 maps, they had a lot of advantages over 16.5s in the past. They no longer really do. So basically, they're originator influence maps, but they're originator influence maps that you cannot apply an astrolabe to anymore. This is the reason that they've fallen behind all of the other strategies. Now, this was a popular sweeping set of changes because there were a lot of things people disliked about tier 17s. However, now what we're seeing is a lot of feedback that is essentially bring back the old tier 17s on the pathofexile subreddit. People aren't saying it in those words, but that's basically what the most common complaining voices are at the moment. People are saying what's lost at the moment is aspirational endgame mapping content. Something that's really hard, something that requires a very powerful character to get to. They didn't necessarily like everything about tier 17s, but they want something along those sorts of lines back. I also want to point out, though, that this is not the only opinion out there. There are people who are loving the current state of the game, and those people are playing the game and not talking on Reddit. In fact, I notice this whenever I jump into my global chat. I run a global chat, it's global 16807. Most of the people that are there are pretty positive about the game. And what we're seeing here is some of the things that come up with Reddit specifically as a feedback mechanism. Reddit is where people go if they're unhappy with the state of the game. If they're happy with the state of the game, they keep playing. So during patch 3.26, the people who liked tier 17s were having the time of their life farming tier 17s. And they stayed in game. They didn't notice the fact that on Reddit, there was a lot of feedback saying, hey, these maps are terrible, get rid of them. And maybe these people didn't like everything about tier 17s. Maybe they really, really hated the Drowning Orbs mod. Maybe they really hated the Tentacle Friends mod. Whatever it was, there were some things they didn't like about them, but they generally thought they were a net positive for the game. They weren't talking about the game, they were playing it. At the same time, another section was saying these tier 17 maps need to have sweeping nerfs made to them so that they're no longer the best way to play the game. I can't keep up with the trade league economy. I'm getting buried under the economic power of the people who are playing in tier 17s all the time. And as a result, I want to see some changes. So Grinding Gear Games look at the feedback they're getting on Reddit, and it's all nerf aspirational endgame mapping. What do? They nerf aspirational endgame mapping. Now we're seeing a backlash. The people who are happy with this change are enjoying the game. They're playing it more. They're not really going and talking on Reddit. The people who dislike it because they prefer the old status quo, again, maybe not liking everything about 17s, but they liked generally the fact that there was this aspirational endgame mapping. They want to see it back. They're angry with the game. They're the ones now who are talking over on the pathofexile subreddit. So I think one of the important lessons about this is that when there is some sort of disagreement in the player base, it's not really enough for Grinding Gear Games to aggregate the feedback that's presented to them. Because if they do that, then what we're going to get is an announcement coming in a day or two saying, hey, we've seen all of the feedback people have given. The 329.2 patch is going to be reducing up tier 17 maps. We're going to be going back to tier 17s. They're going to have 30% more pack size than they've got now. They're going to drop better loot than they do now. This is your aspirational endgame mapping. This is what everyone's been requesting. Enjoy. Also, we've seen there's been a bunch of feedback about this particular mod. We're going to get rid of that, but everything else is going to stay because more challenge means more fun, right? And if Grinding Gear Games do that, then what will happen is that the people who are currently loving the league will start to dislike it more. And the people who have been calling for more aspirational endgame mapping, some of them will come back. Some of them will be like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. I'll check it out in 3.30. Really, it's a tough balance for Grinding Gear Games to fix, unless they try and fix it via a different mechanism. And this ties in to the developer interview that Grinding Gear Games are running tomorrow. And I'm saying tomorrow because it's tomorrow in my time zone. It might be today in yours. The exact time and date are listed down on Grinding Gear Games' site, link in the description below. Zizaran is going to be talking with game designers Octavian and Andrew. Now, Zizaran's interesting here because he's fairly positive about the league personally, but he is also someone who is going to convey opinions that run counter to his own one. So he's going to be someone who'll fairly present opinions of people that are very negative about the league as well. One of the things that Zizaran has called for a while, and that has actually started to be implemented in the game, is a shifting of where loot drops into specific mechanics. And I think there's something that's really interesting that could be taken from this and applied a bit more broadly. You're currently looking at the unique boots Skyforth. There is a reason for this, and we'll come to it in a sec. These used to be chase. They have not stood the test of time very well, but in patch 2.1 when these were added, these were one of the best items in the entire game, and they remained that way for a substantial period of time. They have a very interesting drop mechanic though that I think Grinding Gear Games should consider revisiting. One of the problems we've had in recent leagues is that Grinding Gear Games have axes to make loot more plentiful, but they don't really have axes to make it better, other than having things that are only exclusive to a particular mechanic. So for instance, if you want to make it so that a player is 3 times as likely to get a mage blood from a particular content, the way Grinding Gear Games can do that is either give 200% more quantity to that content, and then not only have you made Mage Blood more likely, but you've also made Chaos Orbs more likely, you've also made Armorer's Scraps more likely, you made basically everything more likely. Or you can increase the item rarity that's found there. But when you do increase the item rarity, you're also tripling the amount, not just of Mage Bloods, but also of all of the lesser uniques as well. So what happens with aspirational farms is that they start to flood the league economy with items that are extremely good, like Aegis Aurora. Now this ends up being a good thing if you want to just trade for an Aegis Aurora for your own build. In fact, this item has almost never been cheaper than it is now. It's like 40 or 50 chaos. It's really, really crazy cheap. It's also a strong contender for the title of best shield in the game. Maybe you might say Svalin, maybe you say Aegis Aurora, maybe you'd say something that's a bit more offensive in nature. But whatever the case, even if you don't think Aegis is the best shield in the game, you definitely consider that it is up there in contention. However, it's not very exciting to loot. It's only like 40 or 50 chaos. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, there's the fact that trade has so much less friction than it used to have now, but mostly it's the fact that all of those aspirational endgame farms that do still exist that are printing Mage Bloods, well, for every Mage Blood they print, they're printing something like 10 or 20 of these. And that's the reason that these end up being so much cheaper than they might have been in the past. However, Granny Gear Games did have a solution for this, not a solution that holds up today, but one that I think they should revisit, and that is what they did with Skyforth. So when Skyforth was added to the game, you might look at this item and say, why does anyone care about it? Well, back in 2.1 when it was added, it was the best set of boots in the game for quite a few builds. And when it was added, Granny Gear Games had a drop restriction on it that was pretty extreme at the time. This is not allowed to drop as item level 1 to 83 loot, only 84 plus. In the present endgame, that doesn't really block it very much. That means that it's able to drop in tier 16s, just not from normal monsters, and it can drop from literally any monster, even the trash monsters, in pinnacle boss areas, and also a number of other places. So you're running Replica Cortex, and Replica Cortex is a level 84 zone. Well, Skyforth can drop even from the trash monsters. You're running a Blight Ravage map. Every single monster there is high enough level to drop Skyforth. What Granny Gear Games could consider doing is having aspirational endgame maps that have higher tiers numerically than we're able to go to at the moment. So tier 17, 18, 19, 20, limits wherever you want to set it. This would then result in higher monster stats in those zones, and not necessarily in better loot in general, because currently level 86 and above bases are all the same as each other. It's not trivial to get level 86 bases anymore, but there's plenty of sources of them, and if it's just a rare item, you don't need a level 87 or 88 or 89 base. You can just use a level 86 one instead. They can roll the same mods. They could then add new unique items that are exclusively available through this new aspirational endgame content. And then that results in that content having some really, really interesting loot, but it doesn't necessarily have to flood the economy with items like Aegis Aurora, rendering them into essentially non-loot like they are now. Instead, items like Aegis Aurora can be the thing that you can get anywhere in the game. Likewise, Mage Blood can just be that miracle drop that can come up anywhere in the game. But a couple of new chase items that come only from the aspirational endgame farms, whatever those end up being, well, that I think would be something that's really interesting. It can make mapping exciting for people that like the hardest mapping in the game, but at the same time, it's not something that's going to feel necessary. Because the thing that people disliked about tier 17s back in their heyday wasn't so much that tier 17s existed, is that they felt necessary for a number of particular farms. And I think the thing that can come up here is that this can then interact with all of these types of scarabs that exist in the game that have the text, League mechanic monsters for this particular mechanic gain increased difficulty and reward for each time you have performed such and such a League mechanic related action. So expedition monsters gain increased difficulty and reward for each remnant detonated if we want to take one of the unpopular versions of this. Or if you wanted to take something that was slightly more popular, you could instead go with the Breach Scarab of Resonant Cascade, which also has the same text, but slightly better version of the effect. These types of scarabs could then just simply have their increased difficulty and reward be +1 or maybe even plus a larger number of monster levels. And then at that point, the loot that comes from them will end up feeling meaningfully better some of the time. Most of the time it won't be, but there will be that chance of getting some of these new chase unique items that could end up being extremely popular. So where would this package of changes leave you if you're someone who likes the idea of old tier 17s or having more aspirational endgame farms? Well, you would end up finding that there's new and exciting loot to discover, but your aspirational endgame farms are not going to produce so many of the sort of basic game items that you end up flooding the market economy completely. What about if you're someone that doesn't like these farms? Well, you just basically don't participate in them, and if there is some item that comes out of them that you want, you circumvent that with trade. This is very similar to the way that currently, if people like Heist, then they can go and run chasing after something like a Simplex or a Focused Amulet. And if you're one of those people that genuinely dislikes Heist, then you simply circumvent it through trade. Of course, there are people who play solo self-found. The idea of solo self-found is that it's a way that you can certify that all of your achievements were yours and yours alone. And if you want the achievement of obtaining this loot this way, well, that's going to be something in solo self-found. You're going to have to do it yourself, even if you don't like the content. Personally, this dynamic is why I don't really like solo self-found very much myself. There's always a couple of areas of the game I'm just not in the mood for in any particular patch, and so I tend to not play solo self-found because it would incentivize me too strongly to go and run that content that I don't really like so much, and I prefer to not do that. But of course, people that like solo self-found is then something that's a new challenge for them to potentially consider going after. So we're mostly talking here about changes that took place between 3.27 and 3.28. Why was 3.28 a very complaint-light league? I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, Grinding Gear Games tried to control the amount of loot that's produced by some of the aspirational farms, but they missed one, or they created a new one that was at the level of old tier 17 farming with a bunch of strategies. What this was Breach. Breach was something that last league was explosive. There were several different forms of it. There was the original version of the explosive farm, which was the Breach Scarab of Resonant Cascade version. And then there were some later strategies that were discovered a bit later in the league. Some of them required actually a more powerful character again than Resonant Cascade, or just put other demands on your character. But these were all very, very powerful farms. And these were something that was tuned more at the level of the sort of loot that you used to get in tier 17 content. Additionally, some of them, not all of them, but some of them were extremely dangerous content to run as well, extremely rippy. And so that captured that feeling of mapping in tier 17s for some section of the people that wanted it. At the same time, it meant that a whole lot of items were basically devalued into non-loot because there were so many of them that were being produced by this gigajuiced farming. But that's another thing. Some people like it when an item like Aegis is cheap and not loot. Some people prefer it when it is something that's an exciting drop. People's opinions will differ there. The other thing, though, was that Mirage had a bunch of exclusive loot that came from the overlap of the league mechanic with existing Atlas mechanics. This is something that was done really well, and it meant that whilst there may have been best ways to farm core game drops, they weren't necessarily the same ways that you would go about farming various other items. What this meant was that, for instance, the Delirium Mirror wasn't something people were really gigajuicing with, but there were definitely really good strategies involving the Delirium Mirror and target farming those Delirium Fogs, the ones that let you re-roll a Cluster Jewel. These were really strong. And this has created new farms that were often quite good, and that because of the nature of the way that a trade league interacts, you'd often be able to find some niche that was currently underfarmed and be able to go and farm in it and find some cool stuff out of doing so. And so Mirage had lots of exclusive loot that was really cool and really in demand. And honestly, it was this stuff going away that I think is the reason that in 329, things hit the fan on these discussions, rather than potentially lasting until 330, as might have happened if Grinding Gear Games had kept some of those items around. Anyway, those are my thoughts on what's going on with loot. These are my thoughts on both why some people are genuinely happy with the current situation, why people are currently dissatisfied with it as well, and what a possible path is that can address some of these concerns without going back to the situation where all of the people that are currently complaining are very happy, but all of the people that are currently very happy with the game are complaining because they feel, oh, now it's just back to another tier 17 season again, where the only approved way to play the game is in tier 17 with this particular set of scarabs that have been mathematically proven to be the best juicing setup. Instead, what I want to see is a situation where people run the content they want. If that's the hardest generic mapping content in the game, there'll be some unique rewards that they get from that. And if other people want those rewards, well, they can potentially negotiate a trade, or alternately, they can do without the items. I'm going to leave it there. May your Valorbs have interesting results, and may you continue to find many of them on the ground, as I have continued to do all through the current league.